Hi everyone. In this second lecture of the week, I would like to focus on and discuss with you these new urban spaces of the early Bronze Age southern Mesopotamian cities during the Early Dynastic Period, roughly 2950 to 2350 BCE. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, this is precisely the time when independent small polities in southern Mesopotamia are developing a kind of a really unique urban landscape with residential neighborhoods, temples and palaces, marketplaces, city walls, and other urban amenities, and establish a culture of votive offerings to the temples, which offered archaeologists really a wealth of materials to talk about these kind of cultural practices at this time period. And Zeynep Bahrani, in our textbook, Art of Mesopotamia, discusses this cultural practice in this week's reading, this material culture with sculpture, the votive image, if you'd like to read in detail. It's really very important to understand this practice. We're particularly going to focus on two regions, particularly. The first is the Diyala River Valley with these two cities of Eshnunna and Kafaje, excavated by the University of Chicago Oriental Institute in 1930s. And then we're going to look at the cities of Girsu and Lagash towards the end of the lecture, excavated by the French archaeologists also in the early 20th century, further south in southern Iraq. This period from 2950 to 2350 BCE is known as the Early Dynastic Period. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, because of the emergence of new dynastic powers in southern Mesopotamia, where we see cities like Tutub, Eshnunna, or Kish, Girsu emerging as regional powerhouses, independent cities, city-states that were built in the form of these sumptuous urban spaces, carried out long-distance trade with surrounding regions like Anatolia, with Iran, with Central Asia, Afghanistan, right, and in the Persian Gulf and beyond. These exotic raw materials they bring from these far landscapes, far countries, really is the hallmark of the material culture of this early dynastic period, and the kind of really new innovative technologies they start to display. So that we're going to look at some of that in this lecture. So the excavations carried out by the Oriental Institute of University of Chicago in the 1930s, in the early 20th century, is pretty significant in the Diyala River Valley because it provides us a kind of a stunning summary of a stunning body of information about urban life in these cities. Because traditionally, these excavations had large exposures exposing large areas of excavation, and so excavating sometimes entire neighborhoods. It helps us to understand the character of these early urban centers. Today, archaeology doesn't really operate that way anymore, so we don't really have such large exposures. So this is something that's kind of really in the 20th century, about 100 years ago. This is how archaeologists were excavating. In that sense, it's really quite fascinating. One striking example of such a site and city known from ancient sources as the ancient city of Tutub, today the site of Kafaje in Iraq. So large exposures, large-scale excavation exposing entire neighborhoods, as you can see in the plan on the left and on the aerial photograph on the right, allowed an urban scale research that was detailed and informative. So looking at Tutub, we see that the city was fortified. If you look at the plan on the left, the city was fortified with a monumental city wall. And inside the walls, we see sort of these traces of dense fabric of mud brick neighborhoods, neighborhoods built of houses that are built of mud brick, with winding alleys and neighborhood shrines. So there were, we're going to talk about a large temple, the Temple Oval, today, but these neighborhoods also had these kind of small neighborhood shrines as well, which were excavated by the Oriental Institute. And in the middle of this urban space, we see a monumental institutions emerge, the palace as well as the temple. And you see that temple, and in front of it, actually, there is a major gate building that led into the city, and beyond that gate was actually a big marketplace. So the big marketplace, the farmers market, was associated exactly with the location of the temple as well. So at a very interesting moment in the history of the city, around maybe 2600 BCE, critical moment, the citizens of Tutub decided to demolish an entire neighborhood, raze it to the ground, raze it to its foundations, and build a massive temple, now known in archaeology as the Temple Oval. We call it the Temple Oval because actually there's no written evidence that actually suggests which Mesopotamian god or goddess this temple was dedicated to. So we are referring to its shape, which is really quite fascinating, has an oval plan. It's a multi-terraced, sort of multi-level temple complex organized around a series of courtyards, and a culminating little shrine on the very highest platform. So with concentric walls that have no sharp edges. What was the anxiety about not having sharp edges, like 90-degree corners in this building, is just very curious. And that's something that we could discuss. Why would you decide to build an oval or circular temple instead of a rectangular one, right? So as we see in later periods. The amount of labor and different construction techniques used in this new and innovative structure points out a very important point in the history of the city. So I'm showing you a section through the building, and you can see that the highest structure is that shrine. And on the very left, in the left end, there is the sort of main gate that leads into. And so you see that there was a very deep trench, about 10 meters deep, that was dug into the soil, really getting to the water level. They wanted to remove the remains of all of the houses within that section, and they got to the water level, and then they filled it with pure sand, sand that was actually brought from some kind of a river, or some kind of purified sand that is clear of any sort of particle materials. So there's an enormous amount of labor that's going into the construction of this temple. The first courtyard included apartments for possibly a high priest of some kind of temple administrator that you see on top right. and extensive kitchen and storage areas, and a larger rectangular courtyard. This courtyard allowed one to approach yet another platform, raised platform, which most likely held the shrine of the venerated deity. We unfortunately don't know who that deity is because of the lack of textual sources. And so I wanted to sort of really give a point that, so this is actually, this temple was built at the beginning of the early dynastic 3 phase of the city, when actually beforehand, in the beginning of the 3rd millennium, there were several sort of small shrines in small neighborhoods. What makes the city to decide to build such a monumental temple by actually erasing an entire neighborhood is just really very, very fascinating. A much more modest temple, a neighborhood temple, actually, that was excavated also by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, was this Abu Temple in Tel Asmar. This is a nearby city. And I wanted to give this example because of a hoard of statues that the archaeologists found in there. This is excavated in the city of Eshnuna, modern Tel Asmar. And this is the square-shaped temple dedicated to the god Abu. In the excavations, the archaeologists, as pointed in the arrow, and you see in the photograph on the left, the archaeologists found a hoard of an extraordinary assemblage of votive statues buried within the just behind the altar of a cult room, belonging in different sites, belonging both men and women, and they became kind of really a major marker of early Mesopotamian art, votive art found in southern Mesopotamia. These are extraordinary votive statues of various heights and sizes, representing both men and women from the city, built of gypsum and inlaid with precious stones like lapis lazuli. These statues have conical bodies and cylindrical legs and square sections, but obey a certain canon of representation. Females have braided hair and one shoulder exposed, while men have long beards, and they all clasp their hands ready to hold a libation cup. A gesture of which is itself a gesture of prayer. What is stunning about these statues is that they have their eyes inlaid with this bright blue lapis lazuli stone, which was quarried and brought all the way from Afghanistan in the Caucasus region, and they used shell for the cornea, and sometimes black limestone or lapis lazuli for the iris. And these intense eyes seem to have been designed to establish a direct and continuous link with the divinity, with the statue of the within the cult center in which they stood. I'm showing you a reconstruction that's actually made for another temple in northern Mesopotamia, but it doesn't matter. It just really gives the idea of these statues. So the idea is that if you are an elite member within the city, you would dedicate one of these statues that would then continuously serve the purpose of your presence and prayer in the cult chamber of the temple. So it's like an extension of the body. of a wealthy, generous person. They remain continuously in veneration of the deity within the culture. Interestingly, because this was an Oriental Institute excavation, these statues are in Chicago, and they are exhibited at the Oriental Institute Museum in Hyde Park. So in normal conditions, I would take my students to go and visit these statues together. But I hope that you will find a chance to go visit them sometime this semester or in the fall. I'm sharing with you in the Blackboard. I'm sharing with you an experimental video, an art video produced by artist Michael Rockowitz, where he has a little American soldier having a conversation with these statues. So I really highly recommend to listen to and watch that video, and that's something that I'd like to discuss in class this week. From these temples, we have yet another artifact type that was dedicated, that was used as a dedication in these temple contexts, and that's the stone votive plaques. These plaques all come. They're about they're about 8 to 10 inches wide, and they're kind of really squarish or rectangular sized structures. Some of them are small, like this, and yeah, and they all come with this kind of a hole, a square hole in the middle, and archaeologists have suggested that they must have been pegged into the mud brick wall through those holes. And presumably exhibited on the walls of the temple itself. What's really fascinating is that these stone plaques, these limestone plaques, are carved with pictorial representations in these registers. Sometimes 3 registers, sometimes 2 registers, as you see in these 2 designs. And in them, what we see represented, it's either feasting, as we see on the right, on the example on the right, or sometimes ceremonies, cult ceremonies that involve libation. And you can see on the one on the left, a nude male figure holding a libation vessel and kind of libating in front of both a temple in the bottom and then a goddess on top, and followed by some family members who are also bringing gifts to the temple. They're really they function like comic strips, and they're kind of really, there's an interesting storytelling that goes on in these. Sometimes in the feasting scene on the right, you see the kind of heads of the household, one woman and one man, sitting and kind of feasting and drinking. In the second in the middle register, we see the bringing of foodstuffs, animals, as dedications perhaps to the temple. And in the bottom, we see musicians and some kind of musicians and acrobats entertaining. So there's a lot of really interesting things going on. And these subject matter, feasting as a frequently emulated subject matter, is something that we also see in cylinder seals in this time period. In the early dynastic cylinder seals, we see similar kinds of representations also appearing both in the stone plaques in the temples, but also in the tiny little bit cylinder seals themselves. So it must have been a very popular topic. And in some of the later examples, this is from 2550 to 2400, early dynastic 3a, in Tello, in Girsu, in southern Iraq. we start to see examples that are actually inscribed. And so these inscriptions, what they do is that they identify who is dedicating and who is being depicted in these scenes. And we are seeing here Mr. Urnanshe and his family that is being depicted in the scene. Another plaque by Urnanshe. This must be a prominent figure who is actually dedicating several plaques to the temple. And we see him in two different, this is a very nicely innovative sort of scene with an inscription. You can see around Urnanshe the inscription that actually identifies, and each person, their skirts, their bodies are inscribed with labels, and they're all labeled in terms of who they are. What we see here in the bottom is Urnanshe is wearing some kind of a ceremonial sheepskin dress, and then a skirt, feasting and drinking in the bottom, with sort of his family depicted smaller than him. And on the upper register, we see him standing carrying a basket of bricks. So carrying a basket of bricks is actually a symbolic gesture of building the temple for the gods. So it's like he's dedicating, he's giving himself as a worker to the temple to restore and build for the temple, build a wall. That's how workers, construction workers, carried mud bricks they carried them in a basket like that. So it became a kind of a symbolic representation of a king's his dedication to the temple as a presentation of himself as a builder of temples. I'd like to conclude this lecture with by discussing a very important monument of visual storytelling from these cities of Girsu and Lagash, and that depicts the border conflict between the regional states of Umma and Lagash in the 25th century BCE. So we're sort of really looking at something that's happening contemporary to what we saw in Tel Asmar and in Kafage. And this is the stelio of Eannatum, or more popularly known as the stelio vultures. If you've taken the Art History 110, my survey class, you would have recognized this from those lectures. The stele is called stelio vultures because of the ferocious vultures depicted on top register of the obverse side. Here in this fragment, you can see the vultures and the inscription there, right? And so the stele was found in fragments like this one, and that art historians have struggled to restore the whole thing together, both considering the inscription and the image. What's really fascinating about it is that the story of this war between Umma and Lagash is actually the kingdom of Lagash is actually recounted, given an account both in pictures and in the text itself, but they tell slightly different stories, and this is kind of really quite interesting. The monument is actually raised by the kingdom of Lagash, who appears to be the winner of this war. And the war was about a dispute over the fields of Ningirsu. So it's for land, basically, for agricultural land. These two kingdoms, Umma and Lagash, were located along one water course. So there was a lot of conflict about who controls this canal, and the control of water, the flow of water, was also a major dispute between these two two states. It was built in limestone in 2460 BCE, and it has those imposing 6-foot tall standing. We're talking about a really tall kind of monument that was set up at the border between Umma and Lagash. So it was set up at the border, so it really functioned like a treaty, it settled a border dispute, and by setting the stele, that border dispute was settled, and the border is marked by the stele itself. So it's composed of these registers of representation that we saw from the Uruk vase and from all those wall plaques that we just looked at. And all of the, once the images are carved, the inscription is carved in the empty spaces that are left from the images. Right, and so the monument, the visual composition itself tells us, you can see all the yellow parts are actually just hypothetical reconstructions by art historians. The visual composition tells us the story of the military victory of Lagash over Umma, and where we see the ceremonially dressed king. He is wearing this kind of a sheepskin war dress, leads his army. You can see him on the left, bringing a military calamity and defeat over Ummites, who are depicted nude, and you can see them defeated and suffering. While the more detailed side on the left recounts the war as a historical war, so we actually see a kind of episodes of a battle that is taking place with Eannatum leading his army. You can see a phalanx of soldiers with their shields and spears moving ahead like Roman soldiers, right? With Eannatum in front. And then in the bottom, you see Eannatum on a chariot attacking with a spear at their enemies. So on the other side, we have actually a mythological scene that is being depicted with Ningirsu, male god Ningirsu that belonged to the city of Girsu, patron deity of Girsu, and his mother, Ninhursag, are depicted actually in this kind of already defeating the Ummites. And so Ningirsu has this kind of symbolic gesture of holding a net of captives, Ummite captives, and you can see some of the captives' head is popping out, and he is smashing them with his mace in his hand. And we also see the Anzu bird he's also holding the Anzu bird. So the Anzu bird as a symbol of divine power also shows up right here, the stealer of Tablet of Destinies, if you remember from the previous lecture. So the Sumerian text, you can see the Sumerian text sort of inscribed in highly pictographic cuneiform script in the leftover spaces from the images. And the text actually tells the story of a different way, sort of complementing the visuals rather than repeating what they're saying. So the story part, the mythology, the historical recounting is done by the pictures, whereas the text itself talks about a certain divine dream and revelation and the settlement of the battle and the conflict. This monument then exemplifies the use of pictorial narrative within a public monument. We're seeing for the first time a public monument that uses both texts and images and really violence in it as well, military conflict, and settles the border dispute. So this is very, very important. And I wanted to wrap up with this ceremonial vase, silver and copper vase, that was also found in Girsu, which had a representation of the Anzu bird, the lion-headed eagle creature who stole the Tablet of Destinies. And this must be one of the votive vases that was dedicated to. This was dedicated by a certain Antimena. It's inscribed, as you can see, it's inscribed on the very top, the king of Lagash, to the god Ningirsu, of the main patron deity of Girsu. So this is the end of the second lecture. And in the final lecture, we will wrap up with the royal tombs of Ur. So thanks for listening.